Good afternoon. My name is Daphne Arnold, and this is my portion of the play project. My group chose to do Beauty and the Beast as an early colonial horrific tragedy type of situation. For the scene, we are going to be focusing on Belle, Prince Adam before his transformation, his twin jealous brother, Prince Gaston, and the evil witch who poisons the beast even though he transforms. So for our project, we were split into pairs and I chose to design the costumes. On my first slide, I have what Belle would have worn in her everyday life. She was the daughter of a coastal ship merchant, and his ships were lost at sea, causing him to fail in his career. And because of this, they moved to America where he was trying to build back up his wealth. And Belle would have worn humble clothing. She would have dressed simply in inexpensive clothing. It would have been a mix of rough woolen fabrics and be layered into a dress fashion. She wore clothes that had slight wear and slight tear because she mended in the house and the garden and she took care of the family. So her fabrics would have shown her working class station as well as her refusal to ask for anything beyond her means or her class status. In her attire, you could see Belle's simple everyday dressing. It would consist of earthy tones that would not come off as extravagant. It would not make her pop, it would not make her stand out. She didn't want to be the center of attention. She just wanted to fall back and she just wanted to live by her means and help her family out. Her gown would have been covered in an apron and often it would have been covered in dirt, grime, from the house, from working in the garden, pulling vegetables, pulling weeds, working with the animals where she lived out in the country. And she would have had a headscarf that she would have used to, of course, cover her hair, or she could have tied it around her neck and it would have been easily drapable. But her scarf also would kind of be tattered because she would use it to carry the vegetables or carry eggs, and sometimes she would use her scarves for cleaning. So it would also show the wear and tear of daily living. On this slide, I just put a simple picture of what her gown would have looked like in the earthy tones, kind of subdued and in the background. Underneath her gown, however, for this time period, a gown would not have been enough like we would wear today. You had to have layers in this time period. And she would have been wearing a cotton, I can't say this word, I've never been able to say this word, chemise, chesum, a little gown underneath her gown, a cotton white gown just to cover her body. She also would have wore a rigid whalebone bodice that would have been like a corset, but it wouldn't have been as extravagant as it would have been if she was in the upper class. It was just very simple, very straightforward. It was laced up or tied in the back just to keep her figure and to also help her structure, her support. And also she would have had multiple layers of skirts on. They would have been cotton underskirts, and she would have worn long woolen socks, stockings, and she would have worn simple leather flats. Next we have Prince Gaston. I chose Prince Gaston next instead of Adam because even though he was the younger brother in this version, he was very jealous. He would have tried to dress in flashy outfits, bright colors like reds and golds. He wanted to stand out from his peers. Because he was the younger brother, he wasn't going to inherit the wealth, so he was severely jealous of his lack in station. Even though he still was a prince, he wasn't going to inherit what he thought he deserved. So he wanted to stand out from the crowd, and he did so in his outfits. In an early colonial royal setting, Gaston would have wore long fitted coats, Again, I can't say this, just a corpse. It's just the long overcoat. It would have been made of rich fabrics, like velvet or brocade, and it would have been trimmed in gold embroidery and brass buttons just to give it some embezzlement, again, to make him pop out. Underneath this, he would have had silk or embroidered waistcoats, a ruffled linen shirt, and he would have had the lace trimmed necktie around his neck. His pants would have been just a knee-high length breeches that would have been made of wool or silk, and he most likely chose silk because, again, he wanted the finer things. And he would have paired this with silk or wool stockings and leather shoes that were topped with silver buckles. He had to make sure that he had the best shoes, real silver buckles, real gold buckles sometimes if he could get his hands on them, because he wanted the finest things he could get. Every aspect of his outfit he used to portray himself higher than he actually was. He needed to fill a hole in his life, and he did so a lot with his outfits. And he also might have wore a powdered wig, which for the time a lot of people did wear because of lack of hygiene, and they had lice, and so they would shave their heads and wear the powdered wigs. However, he would have done it just to have a look of polish. And atop his head, he would have had one of those beaver fur tri-tip hats, tricorn hats, the ones with the 3 points. He didn't wear it a lot, but he would carry it with him. He didn't want it to mess up his extravagant, well-in-placed wig. And in high fashion settings, he might have worn what was called light stays, which would have been like a male type of corset. I could not really find one that I thought he would have worn, so I did leave it off of the PowerPoint. I just wanted to point out it was something that he could have worn during this time period. And this would have been used to improve his posture, which was very important for his outward appearance, and it would have been good to help shape his fit and his waist. The underlayers underneath all this extravagance were still just as extravagant, but they would have been still practical in helping to absorb the sweat and to protect the expensive fabrics from his outer garments. Accessories, he would have used gloves, had a decorative sword. Of course, he was never going to get in a fight. He did not want to mess up his appearance, but he still would have carried the sword to seem like he was important. And he would have had a brass belt with little brass fittings all over it, brass embezzlements. It would have been embroidered with gold, and he would have gloves, and I think that would have completed his look for him. Next, we're going a little bit differently with Prince Adam. Much like Prince Gaston, Prince Adam would have wore the long fitted coat, just a corpse, made of the rich fabrics like the velvet and the brocade. He would have had these trimmed with lace and gold embroidery and the brass buttons. Underneath, he would have had the silk embroidered wool waistcoat with the ruffled linen. His breeches would have been the knee-high length, made of the wool or silk, and he would have paired on with the silk or wool stockings and the leather shoes with the brass buckles or the silver buckles. However, unlike his brother, he did not like standing out. He knew his responsibilities, he knew he was important, but he wasn't so concerned with his appearance. Other things in life were more important to him. So unlike his evil younger twin, the Prince Adam would not have felt the need to be over the top with his appearance, with his styling and color schemes. He would have been confident in his role as the upcoming ruler, and he would have foregone the powdered wig for his natural curls that he would have just tied back loosely with ribbon. And a little further away from Gaston, Prince Adam could be found often in the stables, tending his father's horses or getting lost in his late mother's massive rose gardens. He would have hid away, often dressing down in a more commoner or servant type clothing, the type of clothing he was most comfortable in. When dressing as a commoner, he would trade his royal clothes, his royal finery, for humble, functional clothes. He'd wear coarse linen or wool shirts underneath with undyed faded from the wear. It would often be kind of dirty from messing with the animals or messing with the gardens. You could see dirt on along his cuffs, and he would sometimes have stains, or he would have little blood on his shirt from where he would get nicked from the thorns from the flowers. And underneath his coat, he would have a loose collar and sleeves that were also loose for ease of rolling up, knowing that he was going to be doing manual work. Over this, he would have had a rough spun wool waistcoat or a simple leather jerkin um, for warmth and protection in the winter months. His trousers would have been plain wool or linen breeches, sturdier than his royal ones because they needed to stand up to the weather. They needed to stand up to the manual work that he was doing outside. Um, and he would have held these up with a leather belt. Instead of stockings, he might have worn the thick woolen socks and leather boots or clogs. In his pictures, I put a picture of what his hair would look like if it was just his loose curls tied back, and for his royal wear, it still looks extravagant, but it's darker colors. It's not so bright and popping out. He doesn't have to embellish himself and make himself look better than anybody else. He kind of just also wants to blend into the background. I also put the leather gloves that he would have worn when he was working with the rose garden or tending the horses, and I put a pair of common trousers and his common shirt along with the wool waistcoat. The last character that we are going to see for this portion of the play is the evil witch, who is the one who's responsible for poisoning Prince Adam. For her, in this time period, an early colonial witch, it would have come across as a midwife or healer, but still as someone who had power. They were mysterious, they were dangerous, they were kind of outcast, so they needed to look the part of someone who did not fit into society. She would be simple, and her outer appearance, she would just have a simple, maybe a dark or earthy colored gown, and she would have her layers. They were also dark and weather worn because she was often doing her foraging out in the forest for her herbs and her plants for her potions and stuff like that. Her base layer would consist of a coarse earth toned linen shift over which she would wear a faded wooden gown. It could have been dark, brown. Sometimes she wore green. Again, it was dark. She wanted to blend into the forest. She didn't want to stand out. Her bodice was laced up tightly, but it wasn't always correct because she didn't really care about it that much. She was neglectful in some aspects of her appearance. She wanted to look kind of put together, but again, it wasn't very important. So some things were neglected. Over her shoulders, she had a hood or a shawl or a cape. She would use this to kind of hide herself away from the town. And she also would use her shawl to carry plants, to carry fruits, to carry herbs if she didn't have a basket. So her outer appearance would often be dirty, torn, ragged, tattered from wear and tear being outside in the weather. Her apron that she would carry over her gown, it would also be discolored with the signs of aging and constant foraging in the forest. She would wear, again, the dark hood or the cloak and the linen scarf. Her hair, it would be under her hood, but it wouldn't necessarily be tied back. It would be a wild mass of tangled curls. She would often be barefoot, or if she had to wear shoes, it would be leather flats that she could easily slip it on and off for her rituals. Around her waist, she could have fastened a leather belt. She would have had many pouches and many little spots to put her herbs and her potions, which is how she eventually poisoned Prince Adam. And lastly, she would have had something to tie her cloak together, and it would have been a rose pin with thorns on it for the symbol of the roses. And this isn't exactly part of our scene. However, I did want to put in here what Belle would have looked like once she was actually a prisoner of the castle. Once Prince Adam had been poisoned and transformed and cursed and was living in his dilapidated ruins, and Belle was thrust upon him as his prisoner, what she would look like. So after being imprisoned in the Beast's castle mansion, as it would have been in the early colonial period, Belle, she would wear the dresses that were left out for her. She would never see them left out, but they would be left out in her rooms. They were extravagant gowns that were styled in the colonial aristocracy, but they weren't bright and lively. They were mostly haunted and ghostly because that's how the beast felt. And being a tragedy, you don't want to give her a bright pink dress because that wouldn't make sense. It's supposed to feel dark and mysterious, kind of sad and lonely. So these dark gowns that I have put pictures on the screen, they're meant to represent kind of the haunting, sad nature of Belle's presence within the castle. The sleeves were tight to the elbows, and they were often made of silk or satin because they were for like the royal family of the time, but they were faded or maybe they were just dark colors. They would have long, heavy skirts with bone bodices that the the whalebones in her bodice would feel like she had fingers digging into her, holding her into place, not letting her escape. It would be very painful for her. Her sleeves were tight to the elbows, so she couldn't move too well. It would be ended in worn lace, beautiful but kind of moth-eaten, kind of like it was neglected over time. It would have a modest neckline, no plunges. It would be very, very modest up to the neck. It would tie and would have even more lace to it. And although they were beautiful and they were extravagant and form-fitting, they seemed to engulf her in their heavy silks, further preventing her and weighing her down. And lastly, she would have her shoes. They would be the soft leather shoes kind of that she had before, kind of like flats, but they were a little too tight and they pinched a little too much. They weren't necessarily meant for comfort, but they were more meant to restrict her movement and hinder her ability to run away from the beast. This kind of encompasses what it would have been like for her living in the castle. She wasn't a guest, she was a prisoner. This isn't a happy ever after type of situation. This was meant to be a sad, tragic ending to this story, and I hope that I encompass that well in this presentation.